Some say it was just an acceleration of things that would have happened anyway. But COVID-19 didn't just accelerate the future of retail. It altered it completely. After all, we don't build our lives around retail. Retail has always built itself around our lives. And COVID-19 changed all our lives. How we work, educate, entertain, communicate, and consume, all pulled once and for all across the digital threshold. For some, that's been fatal. Others have struggled to adapt. And for a few, the crisis made them infinitely more powerful and far-reaching. Make no mistake, the pandemic changed everything. But what if COVID-19 is not a cataclysm, but a catalyst? What if instead of retreating to normal, we forge a path to something better? Better for business, better for our customers and staff, and better for the planet. A chance to rethink the purpose and value of our businesses. What if we don't just survive the crisis, but thrive in spite of it? The future belongs to the courageous. Those with the clarity of vision and the strength of will to embrace these opportunities. Those with the passion to resurrect retail. They will be the masters of the new era.
Hello, everyone. I'm Doug Stevens, and I'd like to welcome you to the launch party for my latest book, Resurrecting Retail. I am so glad you've joined us today. I have to begin by saying that Resurrecting Retail was not at all the book that I intended to write. In fact, I was working on a completely different book prior to the pandemic. By early March of 2020, however, as the world descended into crisis, it became increasingly clear that this was the book I had to write. Not as a means of inventorying the wreckage in the retail industry, but rather to offer a roadmap to thrive in spite of it. So I reached out to my publisher and we opted to make a hard pivot to the new book. Well, what ensued was an amazing 7-month journey of research, revelations, and conversations with experts from both within and outside the retail industry. Today, you'll hear from some of those remarkable voices as we illuminate the many ways this crisis has changed the world, the retail industry, and our behavior as consumers. Beginning with my first guest, friend, and author of the book's foreword, Imran Ahmed. Imran is CEO and editor-in-chief of the Business of Fashion, the authority on the $2.5 trillion global fashion and luxury industries. Among his many distinctions, in 2017, just 10 years after founding the Business of Fashion, Imran was appointed by Queen Elizabeth II as a member of the Order of the British Empire for services to the fashion industry. In his beautifully written opening remarks, Imran reflects on the central social and commercial role that the shopping center played in his own life growing up in Canada. In it, he writes, "Looking back now, I realize that going to the mall wasn't just about shopping, it was about everything. It was the center of our community, offering entertainment, inspiration, and escape, all in one place. I can't think of a better statement to highlight the degree to which our relationship with not just the shopping center, but retail as a whole has changed in a post-digital and now post-pandemic world, where much of the social value and commercial utility of the mall sits inside our smartphones." I caught up with Imran from his home in London recently to get his perspective on some of the changes he foresees springing from the pandemic and what he believes it all means for the future of fashion and retail. Imran, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, and also thank you as well again for penning the foreword to the book and so aptly, I think, capturing the degree to which the shopping center was central to all of our lives really growing up. and I think signifying, as we see today, the extent to which the retail world has really changed, and how and I guess how our lives have changed around it. And on that note, I really wanted to get a sense from you, being at the helm of the business of fashion, one of the world's leading publications in the fashion industry. How are you seeing the pandemic change our sense of fashion? If the run up to the pandemic was about sort of the streetwear taking over the boardroom, what are you seeing now? How is the pandemic impacting that?
It's hard to tell, if I'm honest, Doug, because I think everyone's lives have been so completely altered by this situation that we found ourselves in. And it's still only now are we getting hints of what the future might look like in terms of life. I think probably the biggest thing I've been thinking about is the role of work and the way we work. And, a lot of companies are talking about, hybrid models of working, which will mix remote work from home and sometime in an office. And I think, the best laid plans may go disrupted, shall I say, because I don't think people actually know how that's going to work when you have some people in an office, some people at home. Right now, it all works is we're all at home and we're all on a screen. But if you've ever tried interacting with, some people in a room and some people on a screen, it's it's not smooth. So I think there's still some kinks to work out in terms of how we work. And of course, the reason I bring that up is, how we work will impact how we dress. So, certainly what I can say for sure is people will spend more time in offices than we have done in the last year. I know my team is aching to spend time with each other, particularly on creative projects and, brainstorming and all that kind of stuff that is much more fun and productive when you're together. And I do think, some people and in some of our work, we will work from home, and that will impact the way we dress. Mm-hmm. That's one category I've been thinking about. The second category is, in the short term, after this is all over, I'm expecting a huge surge in socializing. As we've been so antisocial, socially distanced over the last 12 months or so, when we do go back into the real world, people are going to want to spend time together. I heard yesterday on a call that 30,000 weddings in Germany alone were canceled last year.
Wow.
Most of those weddings this summer will be canceled again, probably, given the way things are looking. So all those people are still going to want to get married, and there's going to be a huge, surge in occasions. So I think there'll be a lot of feeling that people want to get dressed up. People want to express themselves through their clothes. We're all so tired of wearing sweatshirts and jeans, and the ability to use fashion as a way of expressing yourself has really been muted by the pandemic. So that's another thing I've been thinking about. And the third thing I've been thinking about is, this idea that everyone is talking about, the roaring 20s, and like this, return to consumption in the way that we consumed before. And I have had a lot of thought around my own consumption habits, and I'm sure a lot of people have been thinking about that as well. So while the first and second things that I mentioned, will be true, we will go back into a work environment. There will be occasions, but I think there will be, for at least some portion of consumers, a more responsible way for consuming. So the way I've been talking about it is the responsible roaring 20s, because I don't think, in the fashion industry, we've been having this like really, really, deep and interesting conversations around our planet, basically. And I think for a lot of people who've been sorting through their closets, throwing things away, they're realizing that a lot of these things that they buy, they just sit in a closet. So that's why I find it really hard to think about what fashion is exactly going to be like, because I think there's a lot of things that are still uncertain, and there's lots of different factors at play. So it's hard to make any kind of firm prediction.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Your last point, just sort of around a more considered level of consumption and the degree to which the pandemic has perhaps given some of us time with ourselves to focus on our own habits, and yet on the other hand, I sort of see some people seemingly, not reflecting on this at all. It's just sort of, more stuff. So do you sort of feel that we might, as we are oftentimes in society, we are sort of left with a divide where we have perhaps a more thoughtful consumer on one side, but on the other, maybe those people who are just sort of fatalistic about it and say, it's YOLO sort of thing.
That's exactly how I think about it. I mean, the way when we were in the office here at BOF, all of the younger team members in my company are really passionate about issues around sustainability. But then I would see all of these packages coming through from Zara and ASOS and all of these fast fashion companies. And there's a bit of a contradiction in terms of the way some consumers are behaving and what they believe their core values are. But I think the gap between our values and our behaviors is starting to close.
One last question for you, Imran. In terms of luxury brands selling online, we know that prior to the pandemic, we saw Alibaba do really a tremendous job in bringing brands onto the Tmall Luxury Pavilion platform. I think there's about 200 luxury brands there now. We also know that during the pandemic, Amazon made a bit of a play. That sort of took a page out of Alibaba's playbook with their luxury proposal to brands that sort of said, you can come on our platform, you can develop your own brand presence, we'll allow you to have your data, the relationship with the customer is yours, all very, very similar to Alibaba's approach. But my question to you is, do you think Amazon will figure out luxury? And I know this has been sort of a burning question in the industry for some time. What's your perspective?
I just don't feel like it's in the DNA of that company. I think Amazon is an incredible service for convenience, for efficiency. They've really optimized everything on their shopping pages to the nth degree. Mm-hmm. But that's so different from the kind of experience that luxury brands want to associate themselves with. And so in order for, I think, luxury to really embrace Amazon would have to much more, completely understand and embrace the codes and experience that luxury customers expect. And so, yes, we are all used to really fast service and, next day delivery and, the efficiency of Amazon. And I think what's more likely to happen is luxury brands are going to have to step up their own internal logistics, their own service levels, their own last mile abilities in order to kind of live up to the expectations that Amazon has created for all of us in terms of the way we engage with e-commerce. But right now, I haven't, they've been at it for quite a long time. I haven't seen a really strong sign that they've really understood the mindset shift it's going to take to crack the luxury market.
Yeah, you're right. It's such a commodity platform, and it's become, I think, even more so. Over the last decade or so, it's become much more that way. So yeah, I agree, and hopefully, luxury brands. Maybe the pandemic was the wake up call that they all needed to finally say, okay, guys, it's time to put your digital games together. Imran, thank you so much for your perspective as always, and thank you for being part of the event. Just such a pleasure to have you.
It was such an honor to write the foreword for this book. I'm such a huge admirer of all of your thoughts and ideas as they respect to retail, so it was a real honor. So thank you for asking me.
Well, the honor was mine. Thank you very much.
All right.
As Imran points out, the sheer magnitude of the crisis has forced many of us to consider our own behaviors and attitudes as consumers, attitudes and adaptations that are being shaped by the trauma of this event. And so when I sat down to approach this book, it seemed to me that the place to begin was by taking a look inside the psyche of consumers in crisis. COVID-19 is quite likely the most profound and prolonged trauma that many of us have ever experienced, and so it seems reasonable to assume that there are similarly unprecedented changes in consumer behavior taking shape. My next guest has dedicated the last 40 years of his work to understanding the relationship between existential crises like the one we're going through and human behavior. Sheldon Solomon is professor of psychology at Skidmore College. His studies of the effects of the uniquely human awareness of death on behavior are supported by the National Science Foundation and featured in the documentary film Flight from Death: The Quest for Immortality. He is the co-author of In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror, and The Worm at the Core, on the role of death in life. He is also a recipient of an American Psychological Association Presidential Citation. He joined me from his office at Skidmore College in upstate New York. Sheldon, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so glad you could make it.
It is my pleasure, Doug. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Now, in the book, the way I sort of intro this notion of consumer psychology in times of crisis is essentially to say that there really, we in the retail industry, there's been a lot of talk about, will consumers continue to shop online? Will they be germaphobes when they go back into physical retail? A lot of very superficial questions, but I was really more intrigued about what the consumer psyche is during times of crisis. And when I started to explore that question, all roads led me to a person named Ernest Becker. And I know that Becker is near and dear to your work. Maybe that's a place where we can start. Can you just sort of fill us in on who Becker was and what his thesis was around consumer psychology?
Yes, certainly, Doug. So Ernest Becker was a cultural anthropologist who in the 1970s was interested in understanding the motivational underpinnings of human behavior. He wanted to just say, why do people do things when they do it? And his view was that in order to understand people, we have to recognize that we're not much different than all other living things in some ways, in that we're biologically constructed to want to stay alive. And yet, on the other hand, we're clearly very different, including the sublime capacity to think abstractly and symbolically, and then to take the products of our imagination and literally make them real. And this is very handy for staying alive and prospering. And it also gives us the capacity to be aware of the fact that we exist. And self-consciousness is both exhilarating and dreadful, says Becker. It's great to be alive and to know it, but it's terrifying to be alive and be smart enough to realize that, like all living things, you're going to die someday, and you could die at any time, and that you're not much different biologically than a lizard or a potato. And what Becker argued is that we wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning if that's all we thought about. I'm going to die. I can walk outside and get hit by a comet or a pandemic, and I'm just a breathing piece of defecating meat. And what he says is that we'd be overwhelmed with existential terror unless we embraced culturally constructed belief systems that reduce death anxiety by giving us each a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. Each of our cultures gives us an account of the origin of the universe, tells us what we're supposed to do when we're here, gives us some hope of immortality, either symbolically or literally. And it also gives us opportunities to feel good about ourselves by giving us social roles with standards of value that on a good day provide self-esteem, not narcissism, but the genuine sense that life has meaning and we have value. And what Becker argues is that whether we're aware of it or not, we are always motivated at all times to maintain faith in our culture and faith in our self-esteem. And this is particularly true when existential anxieties are aroused. And I would say that's Becker's view in a nutshell.
Right. And now, as sound as his theories seemed, there was a problem. There was a problem with Becker's work in that it had never really been tested in the real world. And that's where you and your team of researchers come in. Can you talk to us about how you took Becker's theories out of the laboratory or out of the clinic and into the field?
Well, sure. I mean, we started in the laboratory. Becker made these really kind of big claims that death anxiety affects almost everything that people do, even when we're not aware of it. And most folks dismissed that as highly speculative and that there was no evidence. And what we've been doing for the last 40 years or so is to design studies that shows when we remind people of their mortality, sometimes by just asking them to write about their thoughts and feelings about dying. Sometimes we interview them outside the lab, either in front of a funeral parlor or in front of a grocery store. Sometimes back in the lab, we have them watch a computer monitor and we flash the word death for 28 milliseconds, so fast that you don't even know that death is on your mind. And yet, in thousands of studies, what we find consistently is people reminded of their mortality have more favorable reactions to people who are similar to themselves and unfavorable reactions to people who are different. They're more generous to people in their own group, and they're more supportive of certain kinds of political leaders. They're more uncomfortable in natural environments, and they're more eager to have money and stuff, especially stuff that has high status connotations. Our thought, they're also more eager to consume all kinds of substances, be it television, alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. And Becker's point was that consumer behavior, like all of our behavior, is subject to being modified when existential concerns are on our mind. Now, this is not necessarily good or bad. It just depends on the particular behavior in a specific context.
And so, and that's what I found fascinating, because once you explained that to me, this notion of, we sort of rebuild, we attempt to rebuild our worldview, starting with a sense of safety and security, and then kind of climbing the ladder to belonging and self-esteem, all the way through to legacy. It was like, especially at the outset of the pandemic, I could see these behaviors manifesting themselves, really seeing it through the lens of mortality salience for the first time. Now, you had an opportunity with your team to embark on a real world project around mortality salience, and that took place around the events of 9/11. Can you talk to us about that a little bit? And I'm particularly interested to know, are you seeing any similarities, or have you seen any similarities between the attitudes and behaviors at around 9/11 versus the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a fine question, Doug. We argued after September 11th, 2001, that 9/11 was like a giant death reminder, except that it was happening in the real world. And what we predicted in the aftermath of 9/11, therefore, was that all of the affectations that we found in the lab, we would also find happening in the so-called real world. And this was indeed the case. So we know that when you remind people of their mortality, that they're particularly hostile to folks who are different. And of course, hate crimes went up after 9/11. So too did consumer behavior. So President George W. Bush told Americans after 9/11 to go out and shop. And they took him quite seriously. Americans, they shopped, they gambled, they consumed drugs and alcohol. They bought guns, unfortunately, with reckless abandon. And our argument is that this is what happens in times when existential concerns are in the ethereal mist. Now, the pandemic is no different. And we have seen similar outcomes. Folks who study consumer behavior report the same thing. Online shopping, gambling, drug and alcohol consumption up, hate crimes up. But I would submit that this is actually different, same and different at the same time. The pandemic is a much more massive and pervasive death reminder, with more people literally in danger. On top of that, I think most folks are aware much more poignantly and profoundly right now that we're in a tenuous time historically. Got the world on the brink of an environmental catastrophe, increasing political polarization, and even some dangerous movements in some countries towards the right-wing populist leaders. And I think all of that just makes death or salience or mortality salience all the more vivid.
I was thinking about that the other day, just the prolonged nature of this, and the idea that it's not just one event that we sort of internalize and deal with and move on from, but every time there's a new wave or variant of this virus, it's almost like, mortality knocking at the door again. I guess one and perhaps the final question I have for you is, there's this feeling, I suppose, that gets kicked around in the field of consumer behavior that maybe this is the inflection point that we needed. Maybe this is the event that makes us more conscious as consumers. Maybe it's the event that shows us the interconnected nature of humanity, and perhaps even galvanizes us around purpose, around saving our planet and our environment. How do you feel about that? Are in your mind, are we likely to emerge from this as being more enlightened, or will we just kind of revert back to our reptilian ways?
Yeah, both. I don't think it's an overstatement to say we are in a psychological fork in the road. Humanity is at a crossroads of sorts. And my fear is that it wouldn't take more than a few weeks after the pandemic is over. In fact, some people are pretending that it's over, to revert back to their state as mindless consumers of relatively indiscriminate piles of stuff that they yearn for primarily to assuage their existential anxieties, without forming any meaningful ties with the producers of the things that they consume or their communities. I'm with you, though, Doug. I am really hopeful that out of this kind of daunting human dilemma, that a significant chunk of humanity will see this as a psychological wake-up call, and that we will become more focused on becoming discerning consumers. We're all consumers. That's a good thing, and we should see it as such. But I can see us becoming much more discerning about what we buy, who we buy it from. I think Mary Poppins was right when she said enough is as good as a feast, and that economic prosperity does not require unlimited growth in a world of finite resources. And I think Albert Camus was right, the existentialist at the end of The Plague, when he said, we learn in a time of pestilence that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. And I do think that there's grounds for optimism. And I certainly think that to the extent that this is the case, that it is folks in your world that are going to be at the forefront of positive transformations. I don't see it happening in government. I see it happening in these kinds of ventures that engage folks directly, like you're trying to do across time and space. And I wish you the best in that regard. Well,
thank you for that. And I agree with you. I think that, something I say often is that brands, I think, in many ways have become the new church and state. As our as our belief systems in conventional institutions erode, we are looking for that sense of direction and belonging and purpose. And if it's brands that give it to us, so be it.
So be it.
I share your hopefulness and optimism. Professor Sheldon Solomon, it is always, and I mean this very sincerely, it is always fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for being a part of this event and for being part of the book. The conversation was invaluable.
My pleasure, and thank you again for having me.
You bet. I have to say that if I had had more professors like Sheldon when I was in university, I might have spent more time in class. With that said, thanks to my conversation with Professor Solomon and others, Resurrecting Retail presents a model for how mortality salience directly impacts our consumer needs and preferences, and how marketers across categories can use that insight to tailor their messaging and offers. Thanks again to Sheldon Solomon for sharing his insights. If we were having this conversation even 10 years ago, I would have told you that innovation in retail and technology had a migratory path that ran west to east. Tencent was China's Facebook, Youku was China's YouTube, and so on. Since 2015, however, that's changed, and the winds of cutting-edge innovation in retail are now blowing east to west. Companies like Alibaba, JD.com, Pinduoduo, and others are pushing the boundaries of innovation in the retail sector, and in doing so, forcing competitors like Amazon to take a page from their playbooks. It's called New Retail. My next guest has been at the forefront of that new retail revolution, dubbed by some as Alibaba's fashion empress. Christina Fontana is head of fashion and luxury for Tmall Europe and US Alibaba Group. In a recent chat with Christina, she shed light on what new retail really means and how companies like Alibaba are leveraging it to spur a new era in retailing, one that Western retailers ought to be paying attention to. She joined me from Milan. Christina, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here for such an exciting chat.
And it's been a while since we chatted. I think the last time it was for the Business of Fashion podcast. We were sort of exploring the whole notion of what new retail means. And, you know, I think new retail, how do I put this? It's almost like, you know, I sort of feel like back in science class, 10th grade science class, when the professor was talking about something and all the kids in the class seemed to know what the professor was talking about. You felt sometimes like you were the only one in the room that didn't understand what was going on. At least I did. Maybe you were better at science than I was. But I feel with new retail, it's sort of the same sort of thing. You say new retail to executives in the retail industry, and you kind of get these knowing nods. But then shortly into the conversation, you find out that they're sort of equating it with omni-channel retail. But it's a different thing, right? So could you just sort of start there and take us through what's the difference between new retail and omni-channel?
This is a great point about how it is very integral to how businesses are actually running everything about their operations. We started talking about new retail in Alibaba quite a few years ago. Jack Ma came up with the term. And the way that we look at new retail today is basically two things. First of all, we put the customer at the center of everything that we're doing, and we use technology to streamline and improve our operations across all different aspects of our business. So when we look at the online world, we're often thinking about we're going to use this data, we're going to use technology for marketing. And of course, content creation and the marketing that we're using needs to be focused on the consumer, but it goes much beyond that. It goes to ensuring that they have exactly the same experience no matter what touch point they're on. They've come through mobile, they're in the store, they're shopping at home, which of course we've seen so much more of this year. So it's about customer experience. It's about merchandising. I need to be sure that I have the right merchandise in the right store at the right time, so that again, I'm serving the right consumers in the easiest, fastest way. And it's so important for companies because it leads to such greater efficiency that it really helps their bottom line. And there's a fourth point on the services that we offer. So we can't forget the service piece, that again, we're putting the customer at the center of the operations, and we can use the technology to make it easier for them to have an appointment if they want to book an appointment to come in store. Make it easier for them to access after service things that we offer depending on our brand. So it's really about using the technology tools to streamline all aspects of our business and not work in separate silos, and have everything come together focused on the consumer.
Now, Christina, when we spoke several months ago, you also shared an example with me of a brand that Alibaba was working with, and the brand was trying to make some decisions in the market around the location of a new store. And you described to me the way data being pulled from different aspects of the customer's path to purchase and from some of the different parts of the ecosystem, if you will. Alibaba was pulling data from these various parts and sort of putting them together into a cogent strategy for this brand. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that?
They created a pop-up store in a location that they were targeting, which they looked at that target from where they were getting search data, where they were finding their customer base. In China, we're talking about cities that have 50 million, 60 million people. So we need to be in the right neighborhood, in the right area. They looked at the data from their online activities and could see where people were looking to, into their online store. And we put a pop-up directly in that neighborhood. But not only did we use that data to put the pop-up in the neighborhood, when they had the pop-up and they had a grand opening event, we digitized the store completely in 3D. So everybody in China, not just the people in the neighborhood, were able to see the store. But besides being able to see it online, we also invited the right consumers in that neighborhood to participate in an offline event at the moment of the store opening. So we're bringing in the right target audience to that location and creating a customer base, a fan base, we like to call them, for that new physical retail space. And physical retail, even though we do online, remains incredibly important because it's the experience of, the brand DNA and everything about a maison that lets you really experience and enjoy the products that they're making.
And yet in your physical stores, and this is another thing I talk about in the book, whether it's a Fresh Shippo store or in-time department stores, there is the physicality of the experience, but then there's also, again, this thread of data and technology that runs through those experiences, where all of a sudden everything is clickable, everything is scannable. Can you talk about that sort of interface? And maybe the in-time department store example is a great one. Can you talk about how that merging of technology and physicality works?
So even in the example, I'll talk about in-time in a second because you asked me about it, but even in the example of the pop-up store that we used, they had QR codes throughout that pop-up store so that people could scan the products and have all of the information, videos with celebrities, all of the background information about the brand. So even though I'm standing there in the store and I can touch the product, I can also learn about its history, its heritage, etc. And we have the same kind of thing in our in-time department stores. So, and we've actually seen a lot of advancement in the last year and some changes, which I think are very interesting. But basically, again, when I'm in the store, I have a lot of physical displays and touch points that I can access directly through my mobile phone. Now, usually those are going to be QR codes in China. So I can scan product information. I can decide to follow a brand. For us, it's very important that brands are creating followers and fans. So I can be in a store, I can see a product that I like, I can decide to follow that brand by scanning their QR code, and then I can go home and decide to, look at their products calmly and pick which ones I want. Or of course, this is so basic, it doesn't even feel like mentioning, I can buy it in store and have it shipped directly home and all of those basic things. But I think really what's special about the way that it's done is giving people access to additional information and very rich content. I think people don't realize how important content creation and telling people about the brand's tutorials if it's cosmetics, or heritage if it's a hand-sewn bag from Italy, for example. So giving people access to that directly in the store is very powerful.
It's interesting you mentioned content because, another thing I talk about in the book is the idea that experience is really, when you get right down to a molecular level, an experience really is just content. Physical, digital, emotional, cognitive content. And so that idea of being able to leverage technology to bring content to the consumer when they need it in the moment, I find incredibly compelling. Christina, thank you so much, as always, for joining us and sharing your wisdom from the front lines of Alibaba and the Chinese market. I really appreciate you being here.
Great. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. An overarching takeaway from conversations with Christina Fontana and others is not just the blurring of lines between physical and digital, but also a tearing down of the boundaries between commerce and entertainment, something that reached an inflection point during COVID-19. With billions of us housebound and hungry for distraction from lockdown, the pandemic became the inflection point for the erasing of lines between retail and recreation. We wanted and needed both. And yet, as my next guest points out, the technologies we use today to shop digitally are woefully lacking in entertainment value or engagement, a problem she and her company are solving. Nia Singh is the founder and CEO of Obsess, a company that is redefining how we shop online. I caught up with Nia recently to get her thoughts on the evolution of the digital shopping experience. Nia, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Doug. Excited to be here.
Sometimes someone can say one thing and you hear that one thing and it kind of changes the way you look at everything. And the last time you and I spoke, you said something that really stood out to me. And it's just one of those things that you just never really consider until someone mentions it. But you said, the Amazon sort of web convention, that sort of grid setup that Amazon uses and so many other retailers use, you said, it's over 25 years old now. Mm-hmm. And it never really dawned on me. It's like a quarter of a century that we've been dealing with this sort of standard web convention. And that leads us, of course, to you and what you're doing and how your work is defying that. So for those in our audience who might not be familiar with Obsess, can you just first of all tell us what it is exactly that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So Obsess is an experiential e-commerce platform. We enable brands and retailers to create 3D virtual stores on their website. So going from this flat grid interface, completely changing it to something that is fully immersive and visual and lets brands create a discovery-driven experience.
So Nia, you obviously made a decision to go in the direction of CGI and this more sort of immersive environment. What was it exactly that sort of catalyzed that thinking, as opposed to maybe just tweaking, the old format? What was it that spurred this completely new vision?
Yeah, so I think our vision is that brands should be able to express themselves online in the same rich way that they might envision their fashion show or any type of experience. But at the same time, online, if you're creating an experience digitally, you don't have to be limited by what's possible in the physical world. And so with CGI today getting to a point that it can look very photorealistic, look very high quality, it really has enabled our customers to create just all kinds of different experiences. And it's been just amazing to see what brands are making with it. Like we have customers, making all the way from like a virtual rooftop pool for a summer collection to like a Russian ski chalet for a winter collection. Like they have recreated the Apollo Theater in Harlem. And some brands tend to go for a traditional retail look. And then some brands will really create a brand new experience for every season. And I think some of the most interesting ones that brands have created, one is we created the house from the National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation movie for Sam's Club. And so, the over-the-top lighting on Griswold House, and you could actually switch and see different types of lighting. You could go to every room. We just saw super high user engagement, people really interacting with every element of the house. We have had Tommy Hilfiger had created this whole Tommy Planet, and it had all these different parts. One of it was inspired by the surrealist Dutch artist Escher, and had all these stairs going into nowhere. Another part had this futuristic version of London. So so it really gives brands, the CGI really gives brands the creative freedom to create really unique experiences, which is our vision for the future of e-commerce, that every brand should be able to express themselves uniquely to engage customers.
That I was looking at one of your sites this morning, and I believe it was the Ralph Lauren site. And because I think the key element is the lack of discovery, right? When you're shopping on Amazon, it's never a discovery experience. You're not really sort of peeking into little places and finding unique things and happening upon things that are surprising. And yet, just in the first few minutes that I was sort of navigating that Ralph Lauren site, that all of a sudden there's media, there's a performer in the store, and I find myself watching a video, and that's making me think, okay, what else is in the store? But I guess my question is, if you're dealing with a retailer and you are using an old grid pattern type website, sort of just a card index website, it's a pretty easy process to work through that. Where do you start when it could be a store that's underwater or something on a rooftop? Where do you even start that creative process?
Yeah, I would say for our customers, where we like to begin is thinking about what do you want your virtual flagship store to look like, right? So this is the question. Brands know how to design flagship stores or stores in real life, and now you're designing your virtual flagship store. It can have many of the elements or all the elements from your real flagship store, but then it can have many other elements that may not be possible physically. So ultimately, I think we tend to go through a few phases, but the creative direction itself comes from the brand, and then we like to make them think about how are you going to optimize this for digital. If it's a concept of a store, people are looking at this on their phone, right? 80% of people are looking at it on mobile. So using the data, we can really drive from that creative vision into creating essentially a layout and merchandising, which is what you would do in a real life store, but layout merchandising that is optimized for mobile. And then the last layer is the creative content. So the video that you experienced, what we see in the data is the more content, the more interactions you can have in the virtual store, the longer people stay, the more they shop. So then thinking about what is that content that you're going to layer into this experience that you've created. So it's typically kind of those three stages.
I want to talk about one thing before we let you go. You also mentioned something to me the last time we chatted, and you said, I think the way you put it was, and this might sound crazy, but I think that people might start buying virtual clothing and virtual goods.
Yes.
And I think it was maybe a month later, Gucci announced that it was selling a virtual pair of running shoes. And now it's the whole market is piling on. So number one, nice call. And number two, do you really see a viable market for virtual products?
Yes, absolutely. I think we are already getting interest from a lot of, they have launched their virtual goods, and now we are getting interest for virtual goods and virtual stores. So I think this is going to be a huge trend, and I think COVID has accelerated it because our presence has become so much about online and what we are on Zoom and what we are, on social media. And so we don't necessarily have to own all of those things in real life. We can own them virtually, and we can have a virtual presence with a Gucci, jacket. And I think it's absolutely going to grow. Amazing stuff. Well, listen, Nia, continued success with Obsess. Thank you so much for being with us again. I always enjoy our chats. Thanks. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and same here. All the best with the book.
Thank you. And so we are heading into a world where the digital is becoming more physical and the physical is becoming more digital. a world where shopping and entertainment are one. It's a transition that I dig deep into in the book, and it's all part of my long-held belief that what we are really witnessing is not the dominance of digital over physical or physical over digital, but rather a trading of roles between the two. That media today, in every form, is the store. And stores in almost every form are becoming a media channel, perhaps the most powerful media channel that brands have available to them. But as I suggest in the book, to bring that channel to life, brands have to redefine the unique utility and remarkable value they best represent. The unique purpose your brand serves in the customer's life is your new positioning. In other words, if your brand is the answer, what's the question? It can be a surprisingly difficult question for brands to answer. So with that in mind, I present a framework of 10 archetypal business models that I believe will help them do just that. Moreover, the book examines how each of these archetypes can be brought to life through the most difficult of all feats in retail, a memorable customer experience, something near and dear to the heart of my next guest. My friend Rachel Sheckman was an early pioneer at the forefront of the experiential retail movement. She's a fourth-generation retail entrepreneur and founder of Story, a concept store known for its editorial and ever-changing approach to retail. Rachel has been recognized as one of Fast Company's 100 most creative people in business, Fortune magazine's 40 Under 40, and Ad Age's 50 most creative. I spoke to Rachel from her place in Colorado about this historic transformation and her work advising to Camp, a New York City-based retailer and an example of what I term the artist archetype. Rachel, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to chat and talk shop with you.
I love our conversations. I have referred to you in conversation with other people as the Aretha Franklin of experiential retail, the queen of experiential retail. And I thought about it the other day, and we've known each other since, I think we met in 2013.
Yeah.
When Story was on fire, and this whole notion of experiential retail was really just sort of, I think a lot of people thought it was kind of the catchphrase du jour at the time. Certainly, it's proven not to be. I guess my first question for you, and we'll just start sort of big and broad. I think people have speculated that maybe the pandemic is the thing that sticks a pin in experiential retail. Others feel that it may actually catalyze an even greater interest in experiential retail. What are your thoughts on that?
I wish I could say I was psychic, so don't take this as gospel, although that is maybe, by the way, the best compliment I have ever gotten, the Aretha Franklin of retail. Like, I'm just going to I need a moment to just soak that in because that's the best compliment I've ever gotten.
Take it. It's yours.
Especially coming from you. I actually, if I were putting my money down, I'd hedge on the fact that it's going to catapult it further forward. Like, of course, it's going to take a little time, but I don't think that it's going to take years and years and years of time. I just think, if there's anything the pandemic has highlighted more than anything is, the convenience of, buying certain products online. And so I think that retailers are going to have to work twice as hard to get someone in a store, which was already hard before the pandemic, and to really satiate what customers are expecting beyond convenience. And that, leads into experience. So my answer on that one is I'm bullish.
Good. And
I think I'm also bullish.
And I think too that we can expect, as money floods back into digital media and that becomes more and more saturated, and we see the cost of digital media exploding, that maybe retailers will start now looking at their stores a little differently. Now, I also just want to jump tracks here for a second, because in addition to your own work with Story and the experiential retail platforms that you created at Macy's, you also work with a brand called Camp. New York City. And I know that the founder of Camp, Ben Kaufman, is a friend of yours, and you advise to Camp. Now, Camp is one of the brands in the book that I talk about as a retail archetype. I call Camp the artist brand, the brand that takes products that may not be exclusive or unique in and of themselves, but it creates sort of a theatrical experience around those products, and the experience sort of becomes the product. Can you tell us, Rachel, about Camp, what it is and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So Camp really answers the question for families of what are we going to do today? And they show up and meet families where they are, and that might be online or offline. So we have 5 stores, and then we have a rapidly growing, robust digital experience that really has an impressive editorial engine, an amazing team of talent that's just creating new content, multiple times throughout the day and pushing it out. And if I really had to, sum up Camp, I kind of think of it in 3 distinct buckets, right? So you have our store experiences, which are these magical, immersive universes where you'll walk into a gift canteen and there's a speakeasy magic door that goes into 8,000 square feet of experiential retail. And, similar to Story, there's a thematic element to it, right? So you could have cooking camp or art camp or space camp. The second bucket, I think, is looking at digital. And I think one of the things that the pandemic, did magically was kind of forced brands to think differently about their brand. And while lots of experiential physical retailers were struggling, Camp actually exploded because within days of the shutdown, they launched virtual birthday parties. So around the world, there were thousands of virtual birthday parties happening on a weekly basis. They created a virtual camp for Walmart called Camp by Walmart, where you had Drew Barrymore and LeBron James teaching different classes and so on and so forth. They did virtual white elephant party. There's a secret thing launching in the next month or two, also in this space. So it's kind of looking at how do we cherry pick experiential elements that resonate in a physical world and transform that into a digital world, which I also think is an important trend. So it's not just having e-commerce, but what's something that can be theatrical online. And then the third bucket is really how we work with brands in different ways. I mentioned Camp by Walmart. We created a family field day across the country for Scott's Miracle Grow, where families got outside and did different activities. So lots of different things, never sleeping.
Yeah, no kidding. And you mentioned, you used the word theatrical there. And I find that, I find that really interesting. Ben used the same word when I talked to Ben about the business. He said it's a theatrical experience. And in fact, he actually hires people, and I guess he has sort of pick of the litter these days, but he hires people with Broadway experience. Yeah. People that build sets for Ben or people that build sets for Hamilton. How important is it, if I'm a retailer out there, how important is that notion of theatricality? How important is it for a retailer to understand that? Because I guess where I'm going with this is that oftentimes when I talk to retailers about content, I have a feeling what they're hearing me say is advertising and merchandising. But when we talk about theatricality in the experience, how defined is that? How much work and effort goes into planning that content out?
I mean, I think it might not be there yet, but I think soon enough, that's going to be a non-negotiable in the way, service and price and other elements were. I mean, again, the caveat here being, it depends on your market and your audience and your sector and stuff like that, of course. But I think it's a non-negotiable. I think, we have content everywhere, every millisecond, new content from every angle. So why shouldn't brands and retailers be, creators of content, distributors of content, orchestrators of content? Like, I just think that if we don't start seeing brands, facilitate and author content in compelling, engaging ways, I think over time, that will be a problem. I think it's a need to have, not a nice to have. I think Gucci's someone who's amazing at it. And I think, content shows up in different ways, right? Content can be the partnerships you do. Content can be literal content you create. But I think it's a non-negotiable.
So if you were going to give one piece of advice to a retailer out there who is in the midst of the pandemic, obviously concerned, trying to make it through it, wants to take that first step to really embark on an experiential retail platform, what would be the first key piece of advice that you would give them?
One piece of advice? You're limiting me?
One piece. Do or die.
Do or die piece of advice. I'm hesitating because I feel like it's hard to give a piece of advice, not, what advice you would give LVMH is very different than what you would give Goodyear Tire.
True.
So, but I think in general, I would say make sure you have someone on the executive team who's in charge of customer experience, because I don't want to say that as a cop-out and a catch-all, but like at the end of the day, like I always say, like what's something you're giving your customer that you can't get on your couch? And like, are we really thinking holistically about it? And it's definitely not new store. And when I say experience, to be clear, I'm not talking about new carpet and new store fixtures.
Right.
I'm talking about like reimagining your customer service in store. I'm talking about like hiring people from unlikely places. Like, Ben lists for sales associates or camp counselors, as they call them, in Playbill. That's genius, right? Like, I'm not interested in someone who has 20 years experience working on the floor of a department store. I want someone who's theatrical and engaging, right? And who's going to tell a story. So I think like if I was limited to one piece of advice, it would be hire a chief experience officer and make it important, like not make it a figurehead, and give it a seat at the table and a megaphone.
And take risks. I mean, all the things that you just mentioned are risks. As soon as we stop doing the norm, right, we're into the territory of risk. I'm going to say it again. You are the Aretha Franklin of experiential retail. Rachel Sheckman, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me.
In a world where we as consumers can have whatever we want, whenever we want it, with a couple of taps on a piece of glass, accessing product is no longer the consumer's primary problem. The scarcer commodity in today's retail market, however, is well-produced, well-written, and entertaining content. All things that have powered my next guest's business from its beginnings as a blog about watches in 2008 to becoming a global retail powerhouse in the wristwatch market today. A member of the Forbes 40 Under 40 list, Ben Clymer is the founder and executive chairman of Hodinkee, recipient of Fast Company's Award for Most Innovative Companies for the year 2019, and considered the leading voice in the watch industry. A reputation Hodinkee has earned one beautifully crafted piece of content at a time. Ben joined me recently from his place in upstate New York to talk about that journey and why all brands need to start thinking like editorial brands. Ben, thanks for joining me. I'm so glad to have you here today.
It is truly my pleasure, and I mean that with the utmost sincerity.
Well, thank you so much. But before we go much further, I just need to tell you that in some respects, I have to hold you a little bit responsible. Because I think it was around 2012, I started sort of waking up to the idea that as an adult, I should probably own and wear a watch instead of just relying on my phone like so many of us do. And so I started sort of exploring this whole realm of horology and timepieces. And it was actually a piece of content with you and John Mayer in 2013. In what I think was the inaugural episode of Talking Watches, that's what took me down the rabbit hole. And ever since that time, I've basically been working only to buy watches. So just so you're aware. I was saying earlier, I have nothing to do but apologize to you for that. I mean, I am so sorry for that. I know how costly it can be emotionally with relationships, et cetera. I have nothing but regret for turning you onto this world, for sure. I appreciate that. So So once I started to get to know Hodinkee and I started to sort of look at the backstory of where it and you came from, it really is a truly remarkable and inspiring story. So in 2008, you're working in the financial sector. And then 5 years later, you're sitting in the Little Prince restaurant in New York City with John Mayer, talking about his favorite timepieces. Can you fill in those 5 years for me?
Sure. I mean, those are probably the most exciting five years of my life, I would say. I mean, even more so now. The company is obviously much bigger and kind of doing cooler stuff now. But I mean, back then, I think it's important to note: I don't come from a world where like luxury things really existed. Both my parents were teachers. I'm from Rochester, New York, which is like, it is closer to Canada than it is New York City. So, really different world. And I think it's because of that is why Hodinkee really worked. But in those few years, so I was working in the financial industry in 2008. I'm sure some of you will remember Lehman Brothers collapsed. I was working at a competing bank at that time. It was really just chaos in the financial industry. And I didn't really enjoy being there to begin with anyway. But, I was 25 years old and they offered me a salary of like, $96,000 a year, which at 25 is just like, it's absurd. I mean, it's absurd for even today. And a bonus and all this crazy stuff. And again, coming from a really, really, modest, middle-class upbringing, like this was more money than probably either of my parents had ever made in their lifetime. And I was making it at 25. And it's so easy to get kind of caught up in that. And so many have, obviously. And so, but by luck or not, the financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009. And my boss at the time said, hey, there will be layoffs. We don't know when it's really going to happen. So just kind of come in and bide your time and don't get in trouble. So I did that. I started writing. I always loved to write, but never really kind of figured out how I would become a writer. I started writing about the one nice watch that I owned, which was an Omega Speedmaster that my maternal grandfather had given me. And he was my hero. I mean, really somebody that I identified with more in some ways than even my parents. And he had nice things and was an entrepreneur and was just kind of a cool guy. And so he gave me this watch when I was 16. I started researching that Omega and then writing about it on Tumblr and then Squarespace and these kind of early blogging platforms. And then lo and behold, people started coming to the site. And I remember the first day we had 100 people, then the first day we had 1,000 people, then the first day we had 100,000 people on the site. And then I started freelancing for GQ, for Esquire, for the Financial Times, How to Spend It, Forbes, those types of places. And really all I wanted to do was get into a good journalism program. I live in New York, and so the kind of the programs are really NYU and Columbia. I only applied to Columbia and somehow got in. I think that they're still kind of regretting that to this day. But it's one of those things where I was so excited to go to this program that I had really long aspired to be a part of. Never really thought it would happen because I wasn't a journalist. I wasn't a writer. I mean, I got into that journalism program based on a blog about watches, effectively. I mean, not effectively, literally. And which was pretty wild, even in hindsight. So went through the journalism program, met some fascinating people, some of which are still, one of which actually still works at Hodinkee. A few others are still close friends. And then when it came time to look for a job, upon graduation, a lot of my classmates were looking at the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the normal places for a, what they call a desk job, like the finance desk, politics, whatever. Mm-hmm. Those jobs barely existed back then. And this was 2012, 11-ish. And so, think about where they are now. They truly don't exist. In fact, everybody's really a freelancer. And at the time, Hodinkee was already kind of doing okay. I was making a few $1,000s per month on passive income as advertising revenue. And what I really started to realize is that like this thing really had legs, and we started to get more and more attention from bigger sites like the Forbes and the Robb Reports and the GQs and the kind of mainstream lifestyle folks. The New York Times didn't write about me in 2010 or 11, but I was featured in a story about watches back then, which was kind of crazy. My picture was in the New York Times. And so when it came down to like, all right, like, am I going to be a reporter or am I going to be an entrepreneur? The choice was really easy for me. And I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so when I graduated, I hired my first employee who's still with the company. And kind of went off to the races. And then, it really started to take off in around 2012, 2013, when I could dedicate full time to it. I was doing it full time while going to journalism school. And people really started to get into it. And one of the first things we did that I really started to recognized as like real potential was e-commerce. And this was 2012. So immediately after, maybe just before I graduated from Columbia, I had designed some leather straps for my vintage Rolex watch. And instead of buying one just for me, I had ordered 25 or 30 of them. And I just put them up on a Shopify, page. And, we published them, and GQ and Esquire and Hypebeast and all these big men's sites started linking back to it. We sold out in like the first hour, and I was like, oh boy, this is a real thing. And, it was, again, we probably made, I don't know, $800 or, a few $1,000, like nothing crazy at all. But it proved, exactly, it validated that our audience was transactional. And it was actually from that launch that John Mayer reached out, who's now an investor and a friend. He reached out and said, hey, like, love what you're doing, would love to get involved. And we hopped on the phone, and he's just like, this is kind of what the watch world has been waiting for. Like a young, seemingly normal person that is focused less on the cost of things and more on the craft of things. And I think that was a huge differentiator back then, where like, the Robert Board, who's still very much around, like it's like hyper opulent luxury, like luxury for luxury's sake. Whereas like the folks that read our site aren't into the cost is part of the story, of course, but it's really about the craft. And I think, from that moment, John and I became friends. And then one day he was in town to do Letterman or something. And he's like, hey, if you can grab a video guy, which we had at the time, somebody that I met at Columbia, meet me at this cafe. We'll shoot a little thing on my watch collection. And that was it. And that was kind of like internet magic, so to speak. And that video that you mentioned, has turned on millions of people to the watch world, for sure.
These are little chambers for our curiosity and the thought energy we have. I have thousands of thoughts a day, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands. And this is a place to put all that energy that can create this harmonious feeling in your life. For me, you get to pick which watch to put on. Doesn't have to be an AP concept, but if you've got your dress one and your sport one and the one that made your stomach hurt when you bought it, no matter what bracket it was in, you've got a collection,
It seems to me that, two of the things I guess most retailers struggle at all times to sort of communicate to their customer segments is trust, number one, and authority, number two. When we tell you that this is what you should buy, that you take that seriously. And a lot of companies attempt to do that. They attempt to sort of establish those two things through advertising, right, whereas you've established it through deep editorial and a clear, deep understanding of the category. Is that, do you see that as being sort of a call out to other retailers that spend maybe less on advertising and more on content?
Yeah, I think we've seen it in many places, but certainly in the watch world, it is, as you said, it creates a connection to the consumer that is based on knowledge instead of money. And so, if you look at myself and our group of editors, like we're really the 1927 Yankees of watch editors, at least in the English speaking world. These are the superstars. And I've done it, and Jack and Cara and people on our team, like, they get stopped for selfies on the street, and I've signed autographs, which is absurd. But, it's because we explain things in a way that is welcoming and friendly. And again, like we've created a different type of credential that is not financial. So instead of saying, hey, person X has $10 million, therefore he can buy a very expensive, whatever, Patek, we say, what, like, that's cool, but anybody with $10 million can do that. Like,
exactly. Let's
go find the thing that that guy doesn't know about, has never heard of. And I think that is what allowed us to become so much more ingrained into the watch collector's kind of psyche, because we are discovering things for them, we're discovering things for ourselves. And it feels like we're on this journey together, as opposed to us just pitching stuff at them all the time.
Yeah, for sure. Now, for those in the audience that don't know, you did just have a pretty significant round of fundraising, almost $40 million raised, if I'm not mistaken. And you have now acquired Crown and Caliber, major marketplace of pre-owned, right? I think.
Correct.
Yeah. So we can expect, obviously, a greater volume of wristwatch sales. I guess my question is, can we also now expect you to sort of ramp up the content production to go along with that?
Definitely. I think, your piece about us, really kind of touched on why this is so important. And I think, there was a Wall Street Journal story written about our fundraising in December that was I think one of the better stories written about us, and that it was accurate. And, the goal here is to hire more editors and create more content, because that is what drives everything. And I think, it's content, it's community, which is a big part of what we do, and certainly commerce. But without the content, again, I can tell you exactly how much money Hodinkee spent on marketing last year, and that was exactly $0. We don't spend $1 on it. And, last year our shop did more than $20 million in new watch sales. Yeah. And the reason we're able to do that is because our editors are, they're not marketers, and nothing is done strategically at all, but like, that's our funnel. That is exactly what brings people into the site, and they say, oh, wait a minute, like Jack Forrester is quite literally the man who wrote the book on Cartier, which he actually did. And so if you have a vintage Cartier in the shop, it seems like this would be the place to buy it. Cara Barrett wrote a story on women's watches. If you have ladies Bulgari watches in the shop, like that's probably a good place to buy it. And, we also do a really good job, if I may say, of editing out things for the shop. And I think that was another thing where instead of just kind of dumping everything from all these big brands online, we say, you know what, like here are the 7 out of 150 SKUs that like we would actually buy ourselves, and we put those up there.
Right. So it's curation as well. You could add that to the content, community, and curation element as well. Ben, sincerely, thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for being a part of this. And I certainly hope we can keep talking in the future. It's wonderful.
Would love that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. When I'm robbing gas stations to pay for my watch habit, I'll be thinking of you. But just as media, content, and editorial is becoming the store, stores too are embarking on their own transition. Physical stores are no longer bound by any sort of geographic, physical, or temporal boundaries. They're no longer limited to revenue generated within their 4 walls. In the post-pandemic era, stores will become stages, studios, a blurring point between content, commerce, and community. Too often, however, when we think of great content marketing, our minds immediately jump to Fortune 500 brands with deep marketing budgets. My next guest, however, defies that thinking. Nima Kazi is the owner of Candy Me Up, a bulk candy specialty store located in San Diego, California. As you'll hear, while many businesses found themselves paralyzed by the pandemic, Nima and her team used it as a turning point to build new media, gain new customers, and create a new commercial channel for her family business. I talked to her recently from her home in San Diego because, as she was quick to point out, the store was just too busy to film in. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Now, you are joining us, but you are not joining us from your store, because if you were, I would see, I think, a huge Willy Wonka mural behind you, which I don't. So that means you're somewhere else. How come?
So I'm at home right now because we are packaging Easter baskets, and they actually went viral on TikTok. And little did I know that it was going to be such a hit, like on TikTok. And the girls are literally running around the store with their head cut off, trying to get these out and shipped before in time for Easter.
That's a good problem to have.
It is a good problem.
And that's exactly why I was so eager to talk to you. You know, one of our staff brought you to my attention as I was writing this book, and they said, this is just an incredible story. You know, this family-owned business, and now they're blowing up on TikTok. And when we think about these sort of amazing content marketing strategies, oftentimes we think about Fortune 500 companies with huge budgets. Clearly, that's not the case, albeit your business is hugely successful. But can you just sort of take us back to in the midst of the pandemic? What started this whole thing?
Okay, so it all started because of COVID-19. My store wasn't viable the last year. We were down about 30% in sales, which is actually, it was a big hit for us. I didn't know if it was just that year or whatnot, or if it was going to continue. But when we were shut down, the first 2 weeks, we were all trying to figure out what was really going on. Are we going to open the store back up? Are we not? Was this just something that was just going to pass through and life was going to come back to normal? And it didn't, obviously. So while I was at home and I wasn't working, never have I not been working for 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks straight. So what I thought that I had to do was get on social media. And I heard about TikTok. And anytime I heard about TikTok was because they're for like, it's mostly kids are on TikTok. Right. And that's who my target market is. So that's how I went on TikTok. And at first it was just me. And then I'm like, you know what? When me and my brother are together, we're like unstoppable. Let me just bring him along and see how like the viewers react towards us. So we got on TikTok and we just kept on pushing and having just a few views didn't discourage us. One video went viral, and then that's what like lit the fire beneath us. And we're like, let's really get on this and move forward. And
neither of you had any experience doing this sort of thing before, or right? No. Had you had any sort of theatrical experience or anything?
No experience at all.
Wow.
We're just two young adults that just work our butts off all day, every day. And social media, honestly, before was the last thing that we ever did. We just got on because every business was on there, you know?
So the first video goes viral, and then what?
The first video goes viral, and that's when we knew we had something. We went from literally 50 orders a day, and actually that day we had 3,000 orders within an hour.
Oh my gosh.
And I have 2 employees. It was amazing, but yes, it was absolutely amazing.
Wow.
Yes.
So tell me this, what lessons did you learn along the way, Nima, as you were building this audience, which I should mention, I think you have like 750,000 followers now.
I'm almost at 800,000. I think I'm at 794,000, but it grows every single day.
So you're the Kim Kardashian of candy.
I'm the Kim Kardashian of candy. I am definitely the candy queen. I just want to say one thing. I think everyone should take risks. Look into it, obviously, before you take the risk, but a risk is a risk. And if it's one thing that really helped me grow was selling that one item that everyone wanted at the time. And I didn't have money to buy a pallet, and I just took the risk to do it. And now this is where I am today, which is super awesome.
Fantastic. And I'm sure this is only the beginning.
Yes, it definitely is.
Thanks so much again for joining us.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you.
Thanks again to Nima for taking time out to join us and proving that creativity and courage are the most effective forms of capital. And finally, I'd like to share a quick story. In the midst of writing this book, I happened to be going through some things in my office when I came upon another book. It was a book that was given to me by a client, an original printing of The Romance of Commerce by H. Gordon Selfridge, founder of the eponymous department store Selfridges. The first thing that eerily caught my attention was the date of publication, 1918, the heart of the Spanish flu. Like me, Selfridge too found himself in the middle of a pandemic, writing about his observations and aspirations for the retail industry. I couldn't help wondering, what would Selfridge have to say about the retail industry of today? Would he have been disappointed that we've lost much of the theater, spectacle, and pageantry that retail can offer? How would he feel that in the pursuit of the science of retail, we left much of its artistry behind? Would he have bemoaned the commodification of both the products we sell and the people we employ to sell them? Could he have imagined the degree to which our industry would adversely impact the planet? And it occurred to me that in this moment, we as an industry and individuals have a choice. If we believe the pandemic is a cataclysm, chances are we'll be right. But if instead we accept it as a catalyst or even a catapult into a better, brighter future for our businesses, the people that power them, and the planet that supports us, we can be right about that too. Ultimately, as someone once said, futurism is not about accepting the future we get. It's about engineering the future we want. As Imran mentioned at the top, We've heard a lot lately about the potential for our own version of the Roaring '20s, and I firmly believe that we can enjoy that. But to paraphrase William Gibson, the future will not be evenly distributed. The spoils of that prosperity will go to those who do not simply retreat to normal, but instead who use this crisis to rethink, reimagine, and rebuild, and ultimately resurrect the magic and power of outstanding retail experiences. I want to thank all my amazing guests today, as well as the incredible production team that helped us bring them all together, and to each of you for taking time out to join us. I hope you enjoy the book. Thanks for being here.